This happened back in 2009, but after finding this sub, I felt compelled to share. My husband and I were 21, just moved into our first apartment, and I was about 6 months pregnant. The small one-bedroom apartment we found wasn't one of those nicer, corporately owned communities. It was more like a slumlord situation, but rent was cheap and we were just getting started in life. Now, a little backstory. The city we were in was still close to family, and my husband had a great aunt we knew lived nearby. She was one of those family members we would only see at big family reunions, so it wasn't like we had a close relationship. As a great aunt, she was one of like 13 children. You know, back in the day when everyone had 1,000 kids, and she had been married for many years with 4 of her own children. They were all mostly grown up, but being that this was over a decade ago, her youngest was maybe 16 or so at the time. We hardly ever saw him at reunions because he was one of those gang-banging kids that was always getting into trouble. Apart from his poor choices, he was born with a very striking facial deformity that really gave him a unique appearance. We'll call him E. So we had just moved in 2 weeks prior to this incident. I was only working part-time, so I came home early in the day and continued to unpack and organize until my husband got home in the evenings. Our then English bulldog was my faithful companion, and although they have a lazy stigma, she was a great guard dog. So it was early evening and there was still light out when I started hearing banging or prying of some sort coming from the back of the apartment where our bedroom was. On the other side of our bedroom, the back wall faced the parking lot, so we got a significant amount of noise when people came and went. At first, I figured it had to be a gardener or someone loading things from their car. As the noise continued, I realized it was right up against that wall. I peeked out our window, but due to the angle, I really couldn't see much. This noise obviously aggravated our dog, who wouldn't stop barfing. You dog owners know what I'm talking about. And it was starting to make me scared. Cheap rent came with some shady neighbors, and we quickly realized this wasn't going to be a long-term residence. So, this noise continued. My dog continued to barf, and I was getting freaked out because I couldn't see anything outside our window and I didn't have the guts to go investigate. I was really pregnant, and I don't like running even when not pregnant. Finally, my husband made it home just as it's getting dark, and at this point I hadn't heard the noise for nearly an hour. Of course, I tell him right away that I had been freaked out for the last few hours because of banging, prying, and moving going on outside. So yes, he went to investigate and came back saying nothing seemed out of place. Later that same night, we had made dinner, eaten, and my husband was shaving in the bathroom getting ready to take a shower before bed. Suddenly I hear him yell, "Hey!" in the deepest booming voice I had ever heard. I come quickly running to the living room and I see my husband in his boxers stretched from just outside the bathtub with both his hands on the small windows still inside the shower and tub. I ask him what happened, and he turns with an alarming look on his face and says, "Someone's cut the screen." I had chills go straight down my spine and was basically frozen. He yelled for them to get out of here, when some more movement started happening and he slammed the window shut and locked it. This is the uncomfortable part. As soon as he turned around again, out of breath, he says to me, "That was my cousin E." I was so shocked. I asked him if he was sure, and he says he could recognize that face anywhere. And then he started questioning what the odds were that E recognized him, and to this day we really didn't know. Immediately following the incident, we had the manager replace the screen and I placed a dowel in the window to keep it shut. We lasted 9 months in that complex and will never rent from a slumlord again. We have also not seen E since, even before the incident at a family reunion. About 2 years ago, we found out he had been incarcerated and isn't due to be released until 2022. We don't know what the charges were. The family keeps the situation hush-hush, but I truly hope we don't ever see him again. So when I was in high school, it was my senior year. I was 5'3", about 95 pounds. I was at the park down the street from my house waiting for the school bus. Usually my boyfriend, who was already graduated, would drive me to school, but he was busy. I later found out that he was cheating. Well, there was usually a few of us girls there waiting, but this day I was the only one. So I sat at a bench and had one headphone in and one out so I could listen to my surroundings. I've always been cautious of what's going on around me. As I waited, a black Honda pulled up and I immediately noticed it. I kept an eye on it because I had a bad feeling about it. I wasn't making it obvious that I was watching it because I didn't want to look crazy, but after a few minutes, 2 big men got out. I immediately texted my boyfriend that I was at the park and these guys were creeping me out. Of course he didn't text back, so I copy-pasted the same text to my cousin, who was home. I live with my aunt and 2 guy cousins, unwinding down from the night shift. I wanted someone to know the car make and color, plus it was 2 men, and didn't get any responses. When they got out of the car, they started to walk towards me, so I got up from the bench and walked towards the street because the bus was supposed to be there any minute. The driver actually ended up being a little late. As I stood by the street, these men walked up to me and I could feel the bad energy. One guy said hello as the others stood there staring me down. I just did a small smile and a nod, then looked away. Then the same guy, I'll call him number 1, asked how old I was. I didn't respond. I could tell the other guy, number 2, was getting mad that I wasn't feeding into it. Then number 1 kept asking me yes or no questions like, do you have a boyfriend? Do you live close? Do you do drugs? We have some. Do you want some? And then number 2 asked me if I knew what the black market was. I felt a cold rush go over my body and I got the chills. Number 2, who was quiet the whole time, started to tell me how they just got back from Russia, but the way he said it was so scary, also intimidating. I knew they were from somewhere else because they had a strong accent, but I couldn't pinpoint the place. They kept telling me to go to their car because they have drugs. I said no thank you. Trust me, I wasn't a straight edge in high school, but I wasn't stupid either. I would never get into somebody's car that I didn't know. Then number 1 asked if I had a car. I said no and that my bus is almost here. Sorry, I have to go. And by some sort of miracle, the bus rounded the corner and the guys backed off. They had been inching closer and closer as they asked me questions, but before the bus got to me, number 1 handed me a card and said that he has a car shop and to call him sometime if I ever need anything. He even stated that he'd give me a free car. The card looked shifty and I didn't want to grab it, but I knew I needed that number on it to report it. So I took it and they walked off super fast. Finally, the bus stopped and picked me up. As soon as I got on, I started to cry. I had a complete meltdown. It was like all the adrenaline was keeping my mind and body aware and focused while the men were there, but as soon as I was safe, my body and mind gave out. Thankfully, there weren't many people on the bus, so the driver calmed me down before we took off and I explained to her what had happened. When she looked around for the car, they were gone. She said she saw them around me, but thought I knew them because they were so close to my person. The driver called into her dispatch saying that there was an incident so that they could notify the school. She continued to pick all the other students up, but when we got to the school, she walked me into the office. I was absolutely terrified to be alone. The principal came out and so did campus security. They were so sweet and gentle with me as they brought me back to the principal's office. Both were men and they proceeded to ask me questions about the men, the car, and the questions the creeps had asked me. I cried the whole time. Then I pulled out the card that they gave me and handed it to the principal. He looked at the security and said that he was going to call it and act like my dad, so we did. He was on speaker and the number 1 guy actually answered. I knew his voice as if though it were burned into my brain. It took everything in me not to have a panic attack. The principal asked the guy if he could get him a car at a good price and the guy played dumb. The principal said his daughter, me, gave him the card. As soon as he said that, the guy hung up. They tried calling again and the phone was shut off. They eventually disconnected. I could see a shift in the principal and security as soon as the phone clicked. The security got on his phone and called the police and had them come to the school. It was as if they finally knew it was real, like my crazy story wasn't made up. The principal excused himself and the security guard and they talked for a minute in the hall. I could hear everything they were saying. She's lucky to be alive. This is serious. We need to call her parents to come get her." When the police got there, they came into the office that I was sitting in and asked me for the story again and in front of the principal and security guard. I feel like they wanted to see if I was being 100% honest, so I obliged. The officers were straight up with me and told me it sounded like they were watching us girls at that park because they chose the one day that one of us were alone. He also said the card was being used as bait to get me to go where they wanted. I felt sick. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The school called my aunt, but she didn't pick up. The only person that picked up first was my boyfriend. One of the officers talked to him as the other finally got a hold of my aunt. My boyfriend ended up picking me up and taking me home, and I cried the whole time. When I got there, my grandma, uncle, aunt, mom, and cousins were all out front. The women were all in tears, and the men were livid but worried for me. A week later, some girl at another local high school, not far from the park, was saved by other students. She was being dragged into a black Honda by two guys. The other kids stood up and grabbed her and pulled her out of the car. The principal called me into his office, and that's how I found out. They also had the same officers there and had me choose the two guys out of a picture lineup. I pointed them out fast. They were caught. It was in fact those two guys that tried grabbing the girl, a freshman girl. I felt worried for her and sad that she went through worse than I did, and I felt almost free again. Still scared, but not looking over my shoulders as often, and I couldn't believe that they were caught. After that, my family teamed up to drive me to school for the rest of the year. My boyfriend, now ex, also took me some days. I'm thankful to be alive and well, and I'm even more thankful that the girl was also saved by the courageous kids at her high school. For the hunting season of 2017, I got in on a lease with a guy from work. I didn't have time to check the area out before the season started, so the inevitable occurred and I got lost my first day. That morning I left the camp just before dawn. I'm not the kind that hunts from a stand. I'm your traditional stalk and shoot type of hunter. Since I wasn't familiar with the lease and I stupidly left my GPS back at the camp, I had to stick to the main paths in order to not get lost. Most of the morning I did well. However, as I grew tired, I lost focus and veered from the trail. In my defense, I came across this really fresh set of tracks. Of course, I had to follow them. The sucky thing was that they continued on to a neighboring property and I had to stop following them. When I looked up, I realized I was way off the trail and didn't know how to get back. The rest of the day was spent trying to find my way back to camp. About an hour before dark, I noticed a rundown house and cabin in the distance. By now, I wasn't sure whose property I was on. I hoped that if somebody was living there, they could help me, but as I got closer, I could tell the place had been abandoned for a good while. I knocked to make sure, but with no reply, I made myself at home. My first goal was to get a fire going. After I did that, I began combing through the cabinets for food and other things I thought could help me. Not much, but a questionable can of chili and some candles were found. I heated up the chili over the fire and combined it with a half-eaten bag of chips. After dinner, I looked through the bedroom and discovered an old map of the area. I wasn't sure how accurate it would be after all that time, but I was happy to find it. I spread it out on the floor in front of the fireplace and planned my course for the morning. I was shocked to see that I had veered over 5 miles from where I'd started. At some point, I must have dozed off. During the night, I had a super vivid dream that a man was sitting in the chair next to me and just staring. He never said a word. And when I jerked awake and saw that I was alone, I was relieved and quickly fell back asleep. The following morning, I woke up at 6:15 and got my stuff together. I made sure the fire was completely put out and headed back to camp. I just stepped from the house when I came face to face with a strange man. The guy from my dream, in fact. I was confused at first, and when he spoke, I knew my dream had really happened. This man was holding an old Marlin 30-30, not an odd sight for a hunter during deer season. This dude didn't look like a hunter, though. He wore an old, dirty backpack and normal, bright, yet dingy street clothes. His eyes had a very crazed look to them that made me uncomfortable to gaze at. I was surprised, but regained my calm and said, "Good morning." Instead of saying it back, he just stared at me with those crazed black eyes. I began to say something, but he interrupted and asked what I was doing in the cabin. Before I could answer, he blurted out that it was his place. I continued and explained what had happened the day before. The entire time I was telling him this, he was gripping the rifle so tightly his knuckles were beginning to turn white. His behavior was beginning to scare me. The only thing I wanted to do was get back to camp and then home. The last word had barely left my lips before he angrily told me that it was his place. It appeared to have been empty for quite a while, but I wasn't going to argue with him. I apologized as quickly as I could and went on my way. For a good 100 yards or more, I kept looking behind me. I was waiting to get shot in the back. Every time I looked back, he was staring maniacally back at me and death gripping his gun. It took a couple of hours to find my way back, but by then, I'd had plenty of time to dwell upon our encounter, and I was truly freaked out by then. It actually hit me. The guys that were still in camp were happy to see me and asked what had happened. I just said I got lost and camped out for the night, never mentioning the nutcase that I met. I doubt that they take it seriously anyhow. The whole experience had me so scared I wanted nothing more than get home. The other guys must have thought I was crazy. After throwing all my stuff into the back of my truck, I tore off out of there and never returned. I knew I'd never be able to feel safe knowing that kook was somewhere out in the woods, possibly watching our party. That following Monday, my friend asked what had caused me to leave so abruptly. I made up some lie about my wife being sick. I'm not sure if he even believed it. Nothing was said about it again, and maybe, just maybe, things are better that way. There was a thread on the main page asking cops if they have ever experienced anything creepy or odd at a crime scene. I posted the following story, and some people said I should submit it over here. I'm new here, so be gentle. This is the entire post, but the second story is the one that got the most attention. I've seen a lot of suicides, but one sticks out. This elderly female had her adult daughter living with her. She called us because she hadn't seen her daughter for 2 days and hadn't heard her moving around upstairs. The stairway going up was very narrow, and at the top was a direct 90-degree turn into the bedroom. The mother was too elderly to climb the stairs, so she called us. We get there and enter the bedroom and find the daughter dead. She hung herself by tying the rope from her robe around her neck and the other end to the bedpost. Then she just laid on the floor and let her weight compress the rope. Seemed odd because she could have easily just sat up or lifted herself up to keep from being strangled. Almost wouldn't thought her body would have done it on its own as a defense mechanism. Anyway, we untie her and check vitals, but she's gone. We need to check the body for signs of trauma, so we do that. As we're turning her over, the air escapes from her lungs and she goes, and I feel the air blow over my arm. It grossed me out big time. Anyway, we couldn't get her out of the room because the stairway was too narrow. Ambulance arrives and we strap her to a backboard and lower her out the window and down the ladder of the fire truck. I felt terrible for the mother because she was in hysterics and her daughter being tossed out the upstairs window with the whole neighborhood watching. I never found out any details about her body afterwards, so I don't know if she took pills and then laid down and passed out, etc. But that method of suicide struck me as very odd. Next, got an alarm call to a home where someone had committed suicide the year before. The house was still owned by the family, but it sat unused. No one lived there. Another officer and I clear the house and advise dispatch that everything is kosher. No forced entry anywhere, but the back door was unlocked. We contacted the owner and he told us he leaves it unlocked. Whatever. Anyway, we're in the house just looking around, remarking how it's a shame that the house just sits there unused. The other officer goes to take a leak and I'm standing there in the living room when I hear footsteps upstairs. Now, we check the entire upstairs. Each room, every closet, bathroom, etc. My partner yells from the bathroom, "Are those footsteps?" He comes out zipping up and we rush upstairs. Nothing. Doors to the rooms are open. We check each room again. Each closet, everywhere. The upstairs is flat out empty. There wasn't even furniture left in the house. He's in one room and I'm in another when I feel this coldness enter the room. It was just a cold that felt like it encompassed my entire body. Then it was as if someone in front of me shoved me with both hands. It was a very distinct feeling of two hands shoving me backwards by pushing my chest. I'm a cop. Normally someone shoves you and it's game on. But this time there was no one there. Just an empty room. I must have sat there with a stupid look on my face for maybe a second or two. Then I left the room completely creeped out. I met my buddy in the hallway and he tells me I look weird. I tell him what happened and he says, "Yeah, this place is fucking creepy. Let's bounce." It was daytime, and the house was fully lit as there were no curtains or shades on any of the windows. Later, I told my supervisor about it, and he said he went to an alarm call there as well, and as soon as he went inside, he got that creepy feeling where it feels like you're being watched. This took place maybe around the age of 13. Let me set the scene. I had my first serious boyfriend, Sam. Sam was a nerdy kind of guy. We had met at church. When he had asked me out, I was over the moon as another girl had been talking to him at the same time. I was flattered that he had chosen me. At the point in time this story takes place, I was having a lot of issues at home. I had attempted to take my life during my relationship and had a lot of issues with self-harm. My relationship with my parents was terrible. Still is. That probably explains why I never told them any of this. Besides my personal problems, I'd say the relationship was running smoothly until Sam came into contact with Allison. I don't recall exactly when or where Sam met Allison. I believe it was at his Air Cadets. It's almost like she just appeared. Whenever Sam and I were going through a rough patch, he would talk to Allison and she would console him. It made me really uncomfortable at the time, being a jealous 13-year-old. Our key communication was over Skype as he lived a good 40 minutes away from me. On average, I saw him twice a week. Once on a Saturday in which I would catch 2 buses to his home. The second being at church on a Sunday. He would often tell me stories about his long conversations with Allison. How she was hilarious, but she didn't like me, although I had never spoken to her myself. I assume this was due to him mainly speaking to her during our childish arguments. I first came into contact with Allison during an argument with Sam. We were bickering about something unimportant and a message popped up on my Skype. It was from Allison. I don't recall what exactly the message said as this was in 2014, but I tried to gain access to my old Skype to go through the messages but have not been able to. But I do remember her insulting me repeatedly and saying I didn't deserve Sam and I should have died in regards to ending my life. I responded harshly, telling her to screw off or something of the sorts. Was it polite? No. I was extremely standoffish at this age. My response seemed to anger her. I was bombarded with call after call. I declined every single one. I reported to Sam what had gone on and he said he had told her to leave me alone. All was good for a while. This didn't affect me too much. This was semi-normal for me as high school relationship drama was almost an everyday occurrence at my school. Looking back on it, Sam was almost definitely cheating on me, but I was too naive and in childish love to care. My second incident with Allison was on a summer afternoon. I was relaxing on Sam's bed after an afternoon of messing around. He had gone to complete a chore in the kitchen and had left his computer on. I decided to check my Facebook and went to log in. On the screen was a chat with Allison. Being curious, I scrolled through the chat. I was greeted with an onslaught of naked images of her. This started a huge fight, as you can imagine. Sam said that she was just a jealous stalker girl. My third interaction with Allison was at my local library. Allison must have been 16 as she was completing some work experience at the time. I have and still am an avid book reader. I was there with my mother and sister when I saw her at the counter. She stared me down and it took me aback as I didn't recognize her to begin with. It then clicked. I was more annoyed than anything. I didn't pick up a book instead of opting to hang around my sister as she checked some books. Allison's eyes never left me. The time came to leave as Mum was renting the books out. She made small talk with Allison. I was surprised at how polite and well-mannered she was in comparison to the girl who had messaged me. I began to feel guilty for the way I had responded to her. Once at home, I hopped on my phone and wrote a message to her, apologizing for the way I had spoken to her. The message I received back from her was a different tone altogether. She started listing all these terrible names. She said I had no right to date Sam, and all I brought him was misery. This time her words really did affect me. I called Sam and begged him to never contact her again. I remember vividly sobbing and crying for hours. This happened a couple more times, each time escalating in severity. Threats to beat my lights out were sent. My mental health was greatly affected. I wasn't afraid of her, but more upset at the things she said. I never took a single threat seriously. To this day, I have no idea why Sam stayed in contact with her, and I began to avoid the library. My relationship with Sam continued. One day, I got into a large argument with my mother and called Sam sobbing. He consoled me and told me it was going to be all right. Impulsively, I decided to go for a run, leaving my phone at home. I wanted to be out of the home. I was gone for maybe an hour or two. I returned home to an onslaught of messages from Sam, deeply concerned for my well-being. I apologized and explained the situation, a reminder this entire time that I had not blocked Allison. She messaged me with the usual drivel. I was so used to her threats at this point it hardly fazed me. The same threat happened again. "I'll beat your lights out." Calling her bluff, I replied, "Well, go on then. You don't even know where I live." She replied with my address, and my heart skipped a beat. All the threats of violence were all too real now. I remember shaking uncontrollably. I sobbed down the phone to Sam. I begged him to block her and never to speak to her again. He continued to speak to her, although I never did. New girls appeared in her place, but none were as invasive as her. We ended the relationship after a year and a bit. In one of the messages I sent to him regarding our breakup, I spoke about Allison and his stalker girls. It's been a long time since then. Sam and I occasionally speak, and I'd say we are on good terms. He's in a band, and I'm studying still. At the time, I didn't realize the severity of her actions. The fact that she had gone onto the computer base at my library and searched for my address didn't pass my mind until many years later. It still sends shivers down my spine. What would she have been actually capable of doing, I'll never know. I truly hope no one finds out. I tried finding her online out of curiosity, to no avail. If she was capable of that amount of calculation at 16 years old, I wonder what she was capable of now. I hope this serves as a word of warning to parents to look out for their kids. I know this story may not be as severe as many on this subreddit, but I thought I'd share this terrifying tale.